Hello, Montana Lowdown podcast listeners. This is John Adams, your host, bringing you a special bonus episode from our interview this last week with former Lee Newspaper's Capitol Bureau Chief Chuck Johnson. Chuck and I had a wide-ranging conversation, and this section didn't make it into the podcast, but I thought it was something that would be fun to share with you, where Chuck talks about one of his favorite and most memorable legislators and how the Legislative Services Division came to be. I thought it was kind of a fun and informative piece of history that I thought you might enjoy. And so we're bringing it here to you today as a bonus podcast. So for all of you Lowdown listeners, here's another 10 minutes or so of our conversation with Chuck Johnson. Enjoy. So you've covered a lot of politicians over the years, Chuck, both state level, federal level, or House and Senate seats in Congress and the legislature. Talk about some of the more colorful characters that you recall from your years of covering the legislature. Anybody stand out as being somebody who just really was kind of a interesting or fascinating character?
Probably the most interesting legislator I ever covered was a state representative from Harlem, Montana, named Francis Bardanouve. And he was in the legislature, I believe, 34 or 36 years.
And the Legislative Services Division, the wing of the Capitol where they're housed, is named after Francis Bardanouve.
That's correct, and appropriately so. He was a really interesting guy. He was born on a ranch up in Hardin during the Depression. No chance to go to college. Totally self-educated. He was born with a cleft palate, had a serious speech defect. I used to talk to him sometimes over the lunch hour. I'd get a sandwich and eat with him. He told me that in his early years, he was so ashamed of his speech defect. When he went into a restaurant, he'd just point at something on the menu or have someone else order for him. He was very self-conscious. Years later, had surgery that corrected it somewhat. And I always call this one of Montana's great love stories. He was a bachelor, and he and the woman who was his speech therapist fell in love and got married, Venus Bardanouve. But Francis gets elected in 1958. There were no orientation classes that the legislature put on. So he gets elected and he thinks, well, what do I need to learn a little more about things. He gets in his pickup truck. He shows up unannounced at all the state institutions wanting a tour. You know, they were totally unprepared for him. He always talked about at Warm Springs or Boulder, maybe it was Boulder, there were naked little kids sitting on cement floors. One of them grabbed his hand like that and wouldn't let go. He never forgot that. So he was just a really interesting guy.
And he was considered by many to be just a brilliant budget mind, right? I mean, he understood every aspect of the budget in a way that almost nobody else did at the time, right?
He was brilliant on the budget, and he, I believe, was the sponsor of the bill that created the Legislative Fiscal Division. Up until that point, you had the folks from the governor's budget office present the budget, but no legislative independent analysis. So he created that office in the early 70s.
What is it? Let's talk about the Legislative Services Division, the Legislative Fiscal Division. Let's talk a little bit about what they do and why they're so important, because I think the average Montanan doesn't really realize that there's a whole slew of staff that are up at the legislature year round that basically work for the legislative branch. And those are the permanent staff that are there all the time. Legislators come and go, but those legislative staffers stay there, and they do everything from analyze the budget to writing individual pieces of legislation.
Better yet, let's talk about the days before them.
Yeah.
So if you were a legislator newly elected from, Miles City or Great Falls or Glendive or whatever, and you think you come in with 5 or 6 ideas you want to turn into bills, you had to find a way to get an attorney to draft those bills. Not state attorneys, there were none for the legislature. So here's what happened. The major economic interests, Montana Power Company, Anaconda Company, the railroad, all had what they called watering holes. And they'd rent suites in hotels. The Placer Hotel was the principal one, Jorgensen's. They would be open 24/7. You could get food and drinks there. They would have a bear and a beef and a chef. Someone would carve the beef up for a meal or sandwiches, any drink you wanted. Oh, and if you wanted a bill drafted, well, the Montana Power, railroad lawyers, or Anaconda Company lawyers would be around to draft a bill. Very nice situation. I don't think they drafted bills that would have raised the taxes paid by copper companies or would have provided for more consumer oversight of the Montana Power Company or the railroads. So it was a pretty slipshod way to do things. In the late 50s, the legislature tried to pass what was then known as the Legislative Council, an independent research arm with attorneys and researchers. and it was struck down once or twice in court, and the powers that be really resisted it. And finally it passed. And as you know, John, these are people that develop expertise in the field, whether it's healthcare or taxes or transportation or economic development. And they staff committees during the interim. They're nonpartisan, they're neutral, and they do the job, and then they draft all the bills.
And some of them are former journalists. I think there's three that I can think of right off the top of my head that
I can think of probably at least that many. And so then came the Legislative Audit Division. And again, it was to examine the books of the executive agencies and even the legislative agencies. One of the first audits they did, and this was under the first legislative auditor, a guy named Morris Brusette, there was an audit that looked at how state agencies invested their spare cash. It was the darndest thing. It found that this money was put in, there are 170 or something like that, state agencies, boards, bureaus. Each invested it separately in local banks. Many of them paid no interest. So you have millions of dollars just sitting in banks drawing no interest. One of the first legislative audits looked at how much money the state could make if they invested in a lump sum and got interest from the banks. So, of course, that was what was done. Third branch that came along was the fiscal division. And they examine fiscal choices. They look at budget options, tax options. So you have a lot of expertise down in the east wing of the Capitol. And, they don't come in with agendas. They come in to review the budget, to review the taxes, to review legislation regarding health and guns and, labor and industry, everything. So imagine how the legislature would be if they didn't have that expertise. It was pretty well controlled by the corporations in those days.
And that was something that Francis Bardanouve, the Harlem Highline legend, we have him to thank for that.
Yeah. One of my favorite stories about Francis was in the last election. And for the first time in decades, he had a primary opponent. It was a tribal member named Lauren Stiffarm, whose nickname was Bum Stiffarm.
That's a great name.
Yeah. And I got the tip from Ray Peck, a legislator I knew from Havre, who was a very good legislator. And Francis had a tough race on his hands. And he started putting ads in the weekly newspapers that said, I'd appreciate your vote. I'll work hard for you. But if you can't vote for me, please consider voting for Bum Stiffarm. He's a smart guy and a good guy, and he'll do a good job for you. Well, Stiffarm was like, what do you do? So he started running ads saying, I'd appreciate your vote. I'll work hard. But if you can't vote for me, Francis has done a great job. So you have these dueling ads praising each other. And the AP picked up my story. I think I wrote it for the Tribune. And the next thing I know, Charles Osgood, a CBS, one of the stars of their radio department, who wrote these little poems of things. He wrote a great poem about the race, about each of them patting each other in the back. And Francis won, of course. And then he went on to serve. And I believe that was his last session in the legislature. But he was a well-regarded person by everybody. And he was not a neutral guy. He would get furious at Republicans. And when they tried to cut the coal tax, he'd pull $20 bills out of his wallet and wave them at the Republicans. So he had a temper. His nickname, one of his best friends was Governor Ted Schwinden, who served with him in the legislature. And Schwinden called him Torp. That was his nickname for torpedo, because Francis had a temper, but they were best friends. And I think Ted Schwinden was the best man at Francis and his wife's wedding.
And didn't Francis also, wasn't he famous for floor speeches that would go on for an hour or more?
I don't remember an hour, but he could stand up and talk. And it's interesting because a guy who was embarrassed and wouldn't order himself from the menu became one of the most eloquent people in the Montana legislature. And I think he was just an honest man who did has best. And I thought it was a very deserving accolade to name that wing after him. And then there's a nice plaque and a bas-relief sculpture of him down there. And I'd urge your listeners, if they get to Helena, go down and read that, because he was just a wonderful man.
Thanks to all of you for listeners of the Montana Lowdown podcast. The Montana Lowdown is a production of Montana Free Press, an independent nonprofit news organization supported by readers and listeners like you. You can learn more about the people, issues, and topics featured on the Montana Lowdown by visiting our website, montanafreepress.org. Audio editing, mixing, and technical assistance provided by Alex McKenzie. Our theme song was composed and performed by Montana artist Dan Dubuque and was recorded by 408 Productions. Check them out online at 408productions.com. I'm Montana Free Press founder and editor John Adams. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us for our next conversation.